Welcome to Answers Unleashed, a talk show to help you reshape your brain with science and faith so you find the answers in front of you. Hi, I am your host, Olympia LePoint. Welcome to our episode of climate change and the effects of rising sea levels. All right, I know that's a title for you. Climate change and the effects of rising sea levels. Now, I am broadcasting here from Los Angeles at a residence because, as you know, the pandemic has shut down everything, and our studio that was normally at the campus is now closed. So I'm giving these podcasts here from a residence, and I am here in an air-conditioned room. And do you know how hot it is outside? It's 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that is really high. This is here in Los Angeles, but it's not just in Los Angeles that this is happening. We're experiencing a heat wave in Canada, in Oregon, in Utah, where we're seeing triple digits in Canada. Can you believe that? Canada! And so there's a lot of things that are happening because of climate change. And if you're wondering, climate change is real. Climate change is referring to the change in weather patterns that is happening due to severe temperature changes here on Earth, as well as the type of ways that the Earth is naturally shifting to change a pattern in the weather system. And we're seeing it across the world. We're seeing it with volcanic eruptions. We're seeing it within hurricanes that are coming up and going to Florida and even blowing all the way to New York. We're seeing also rising sea levels. And we're seeing melting ice on the poles. Now, climate change is due to several different factors. One major factor is due to the emissions that we have from vehicles here on Earth and the pollution that is caused from travel, as well as a couple other things I theorize later on in this particular podcast. Climate change is affecting us, and it is causing the ice in the North and South poles to melt. And when it melts, it causes rising sea levels. Now, there is extreme danger in rising sea levels, and it's not in the way that you expect. In today's podcast, I'm going to outline I actually wrote it down. It is 8 different steps in which rising sea levels will impact you on land. If you are on the coast, it doesn't matter what country you are in, you will be affected. And it's going to be affecting people across the world. It is not one country type of situation. It is an entire world situation. And we're going to look at how rising sea levels will more than likely affect people in cities, even if they're a couple of miles away from the ocean. All right. I watched the news the other day, and it was terrible. If you're watching the news, this particular podcast is filmed today, July 7th, 2021. And a couple of days ago, I think it was last week, a little over a week ago, individuals lost their lives. A gigantic condominium complex fell to the ground and crushed residents that were inside. This was in Miami, Florida. Now, the excavation crews are there recovering the dead bodies, and so far hundreds of people are missing. And it is a horrible event. And there was some triggering event that the structural engineers are still investigating. It's going to take a while before structural engineers will know exactly what happened in that event. However, there was a triggering effect that caused the entire building to collapse into rubble. If you watched one of my TED-like talks at California State University in Northridge. You know, I lived through the Northridge earthquake, in which I was in a building that collapsed while we were getting out of it. And if you get a chance, watch that on answersunleashed.com/live lectures underneath the Your Brain Masterclass. I talk about how there's, in these traumatic situations, there's these safety concerns, and the safety concerns is the buildings collapsing. Well, what if I told you that climate change is causing rising sea levels and buildings can collapse because of it? Now you're thinking like, whoa, how is that possible? What is the relationship between rising sea levels and our safety in cities? Well, you know me, I'm a scientist, and specifically, I'm a rocket scientist that loves every bit of science. And so what I decided to do is write down the 8 steps in which rising sea levels will more than likely affect people in cities and in cities or in coastlines across the world. And there's a 3-step process to actually, 1, reverse it, and 2, actually start protecting people against these type of major collapsing buildings. Now, I must iterate. The structural engineers in Florida are still trying to figure out what exactly happened. But what I'm going to introduce to you is the chain of events that happens due to rising sea levels, and how that more than likely will affect us in cities across the world. And I'm living in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a beautiful place, and you know it is just miles away from the ocean. This particular theory that I'm going to introduce with rising sea levels is something that everyone should be concerned about. All right, let's break this down. Let's think about this. We have climate change. And the first step in this process of what rising sea levels does in the earth and how that's going to affect people in cities, and even people on islands too, in even a more dramatic way. But let's talk about cities and industrialized places on the coastline. First, we have the particular ice that's melting on the North and South poles. Now, there's huge icebergs. There's huge sheets of ice that was covering these massive areas, just melting down. The reason? Trapped gases and trapped heat on the Earth's surface. NASA recently was able to determine that there is more excess heat on the Earth and trapped in our Earth's atmosphere than has ever been recognized in the past. Heat causes ice to melt. Now, northern and southern poles have witnessed large amounts of ice melting. So what does the ice do? The ice then creates a higher ocean level. Now, if you think of the water, if you pour it out of a glass, the water still exists, and it exists on the surface of a counter, let's say. If you poured the water on the surface of the counter, the water still exists. It will be on the counter. Water, when it moves, it displaces certain type of things, and we're going to get into that. When there's more water in the ocean, it travels to land. And this is how it travels to land. The salt water travels not necessarily above land, it travels beneath it. It affects the water tables underneath the ground. Let me describe it to you like this. Have you ever gone to the beach and you've seen the water come in? Where the water comes in, and as it's coming in, it's simultaneously pulling out the water that is on the sand at the same time as it comes in. You've noticed that? So when the salt water comes onto shore, right before that, the water that already is existing on land is pulled towards the ocean water, and then the salt water now comes and takes its place. Well, that happens underground. Let me describe this to you. Now, fresh water tables exist underneath our ground. So let me break this down for us in these steps. First, the water in the poles melt, the ice melts. Then that causes higher sea levels. And then when it causes higher sea levels, it affects the underground water. Now, what happens with well, let me describe this to you just in case you don't know. Land has water in it, but it's underneath the surface. It's called water tables. This is fresh water. This is fresh water that actually feeds the soil. And you see wells built up. It's because the wells go down enough into the earth to tap into the fresh water system that happens directly below the surface of the earth. So what happens in the case when salt water comes to the continent, the salt water, as it's coming to the continent, gravitational forces on the earth pulls some of, not all of it, some of the fresh water towards the ocean. Just like if you were on the sand and seeing the water move towards the ocean and the ocean water coming up, well, that happens underground. This ocean water comes up, and the fresh water then is pulled towards the ocean. The salt water doesn't necessarily always go over the land. It can go underneath it. When it goes underneath it, it pulls the fresh water away, and it pulls in the salt water underground. Now let me describe how critical that process is. When the salt water comes into the area that the fresh water was, now salt water is in the place of fresh water, and what people would normally drink with fresh water is not there to tap into. It gets deeper. And the same water, the fresh water source that is used to feed the plants and crops, is no longer there. What it's replaced with is salt water. Now, this salt water seeps into underground tables. That's the fourth step in this process. All right, the fifth step, I'm going to tell you what this is. The fresh water that still is there, because not all of it's pulled out to the ocean, but the fresh water that is there actually sinks down to the bottom, and the salt water comes up on top. So normally with the wells would tap into the fresh water, it's tapping into salt water, salted water. And so this fresh water, which was primarily this underground water, now goes to the bottom, and it's difficult to access. It's harder to access. And there's much needed work to try and access the fresh water opposed to the salt water that's on top. All right, the sixth step, let me tell you what this is. It is anything that is built on the land is affected by the salt water directly underneath it. Now, let's break this down. You know how you see parking structures or even the skyscrapers? In order for these large structures to exist, there has to be what we call reinforcing. There's steel rebar that's planted deep into the earth, deep into the earth to keep that high rise from shaking, keep that high rise from sinking, and keep that high rise stable. There's also concrete. Concrete is used to be able to keep this steel rebar in place, and there's a whole study of building bridges and structures in a way that's going to create safety. What can happen, and it hasn't necessarily been proven yet. This is why this is a theory, and I want you to listen. And there's going to be somebody listening to this who is going to create a solution. I don't know who you are, but I'm talking to you right now. And you're going to, in the next, I say probably 10 to 15 years, have a whole system in place. And it's because you're watching this video. And system in place to actually solve this problem. So this is the reason why I'm giving this podcast right now. It's to inspire you to create the solution. So what happens when the salt water goes underneath the Earth's surface and it replaces the freshwater system is that this salt water then starts to corrode the steel rebar that's used to reinforce these bridges, used to reinforce the high rises, use it to reinforce the tall condominium complexes. And this rebar starts to corrode. Now, if you've seen any type of metal, anytime it's around salt water for a long period of time, it starts to rust. That's what we call corrosion. So what also happens is that concrete begins to crack and buckle. Once the concrete is like your glue. It allows you to be able to keep things together. It's like your high reinforced glue. But if you know there's such thing as glue remover, right? You've seen that where you put it underneath where the glue is actually attaching two objects together, and then the glue starts to come apart and you can separate it. Well, that's what the salt water does with the concrete. The salt water then starts to unglue the concrete and make it crack. All right, so when this happens, let me break this down for you. The foundations of buildings become unstable. And it's not just buildings, it's bridges, it's high rises, it's these buildings that we automatically assume is safe because how deeply it's planted into the ground. And so if it becomes unstable, there can be what we call triggering event in science that could make everything fall apart. Now, the goal is to avoid a triggering event. Like a triggering event, we've seen it within, let's say, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We've seen it with a triggering event is something like a plane crashing into a building. That's a triggering event that will create the building to collapse. Now, that's an obvious one. And so we all witnessed that across the world in 2001. In the case of a triggering event, when there's already corrosion of the foundation, a triggering event can be something as simple as an earthquake, or as simple as someone doing construction next door and causing the ground to shake. So you're asking, well, what can we do? What can we do? We're humans. This is like rising sea level. It's like something that's inevitable. You think, but actually, I'm going to suggest 3 things that we can do in order to help prevent the catastrophic impacts of rising sea levels. Number 1, what I recommend, and this is for someone out there, I don't know who this is, but there's ways that we can invest in making salt water to become fresh water. There is different processing that exists to transfer salt water into drinking water. Now you're like, how is that possible? Well, there's different type of inventions that has already been created to do that, as well as there are future innovations that will occur on a massive scale for that to happen. If there are ways for science across the world to invest in these type of machines to make salt water in the form where it can be fresh water, we could then take the groundwater that exists and process it so it is now water that could be used for plants, crops, drinking. And there's a lot of science that needs to be tested and gone into this. But that's an opportunity in the future to be able to deal with this type of situation. The second thing that can be done is that there can be investment on verifying that high level structures like high rises are going to be stable. Now, this would require governments across the world to check buildings that are next to seas, next to rising sea levels. And this would be an estimate 5 to 7 miles inland from the sea. Now, there would be individuals to check the structural integrity of these buildings to ensure that these buildings actually do meet safety requirements and there's not going to be a triggering event like an earthquake or next door construction that's going to cause it to collapse, but rather the building would stay stable. And there could be additional engineers to find out ways to be able to use metals that do not corrode in the presence of salt water. And that's highly possible if the metal is constructed in a way that resists corrosion. Now, we see this on stainless steel metals that exist. It's a certain way in which metals are cooked. It's called metallurgy in science. Let me say it out my mouth right. There's ways in which metals are cooked together to create a structural compound that makes it robust, meaning makes it indestructible when it has salt in its presence. So there can be different ways of building buildings that will make it have strong structural integrity in the presence of salt water underneath the ground. All right. And then the third thing in which can be done is that we can reduce the emissions here on this planet. That is a huge, huge deal. Right now, there's an initiative in 2036, I believe, to create the California in the United States, initiative to have all cars be electric by that time. All cars on the road be electric. So that means that there's going to be electric batteries going to be used to prevent these type of situations in which would increase emissions on Earth, which causes higher temperatures around the Earth. And we have the opportunity now to do something about it. I say we have a 3 to 4 year time window to significantly make changes so there is less emissions. So we will not be in a downward spiral, but we can start to reverse what we're seeing today. We even saw it during the pandemic. There's so many people that were at home, not traveling, that the air quality across the world had been its best in over 20 years. So it's 100% possible. We can do this. And there's going to be scientists who will be able to devise this. Now, in one of my next talks, I'm going to be talking about what causes climate change, and that's a completely new topic. But if I leave you with this, it's that rising sea levels will affect everyone on the face of this planet, and it will affect the people that are on the coast. But the good news is that we can protect people by using science in, number one, and here's my theory, making sure that we can convert salt water into water that can be used for living beings. 2, create safety measures to ensure the structural integrity of different buildings. And then 3, we can start reducing what causes the climate change to begin with. I always hope that you enjoy these talks. Of course, I always love breaking down science for you so you understand it. Always check us out on answersunleashed.com/podcast, where you can see all the different podcasts that we create. For our books, go to answersunleashed.com/books, where you can see the different science educational books that are created to help you change the way that you think and make decisions in a powerful way. And you can watch our live and virtual lectures also on answersunleashed.com. I am your host, Olympia LePoint, and it is always a pleasure to be with you today. Find me on Instagram under Olympia LePoint, Facebook under Olympia LePoint, Twitter under Olympia LePoint, and on YouTube under Answers Unleashed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.